Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So today we wanted to talk about speaking at conferences. David and I have both done a lot of it. David, you're right in the middle of two conferences now. And a lot of developers, both attend conferences, and also many developers are asked to speak at developer conferences. And so there's certainly a lot of interest around this topic, I'd say. And we figured we'd go over kind of what it's like to speak at a conference, why you might want to, why you might not want to, the process involved, and kind of how to manage it. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of thing that I remember being very intimidated by when I was early in my career. That when I was in the phase where I would really only ever attend conferences, and I'd kind of go and I'd see these people do this thing up on a stage, and it would feel very scary. And my hope is that we can kind of make that a little less scary, or at least put some handles on it for if you're someone who is trying to think about getting into this or wanting to start doing conference speaking, to make it a little bit less scary, because it's not really as scary as it may sometimes feel.
Yeah. And so, first, let's assume that there's a conference that you either want to submit a proposal to or that has asked you to speak. So assume basically that you're in the planning process or the deciding process. One thing to think about is is this the kind of thing you want to do, and what are you looking to get out of it? It is not a quick or easy process. It is not something that you can just kind of blow off and get on with your life. It takes a lot of time to prepare for conference speaking, and I'd say most of my talks I'm probably preparing for maybe a week ahead of time, like a solid week, and that might be spread out across more time spans, but it's about a week of work, I would say, for a good talk. Is that about it right for you?
I'd say so. I mean, I think I probably spend typically 2 to 3 days just getting the talk like I want it, in terms of the structure and the slides and the overall kind of flow of it. And then it's probably another couple of days, where it starts to become more spread out, but of just practicing, of going through and doing it over and over again. And especially depending on how long your conference slot is, so sometimes I've done conference speaking where I'm only doing, 15, 20-minute talks, where rehearsal is a bit easier because, doing a full run through you can do pretty quickly. But I've also done talks where it's 45 minutes to an hour, where then the rehearsal schedule gets a little bit longer and more drawn out, because if you want to do a single run through, it takes a full hour to do that run through. But overall, yeah, I'd say it's about a week if you want to do it well. And I think that is something that when I was first the first time I ever said yes to doing a conference speech, I remember having no real concept of how long it was going to take. I was like, it's the kind of thing, maybe it's I'll spend an afternoon kind of putting it together. And how wrong I was about that, I think is a good thing to say, just because if you don't plan for it in that way and factor that in, whether you can both afford the time for it, and then if you actually just have the ability to do it, is definitely something that if you're not expecting it, it's easy to imagine that, the output only, in some ways it's even harder when you're just trying to put together a 15-minute talk. It seems like that should be really easy, but trying to have something that's concise and to the point in that period of time takes way more effort than you'd probably even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the places I usually start is by writing out the bulk of what I'm going to say, kind of like in an outline format that's kind of like an informal outline. So it's kind of like halfway between an outline and a blog post. Because what the basis of any good talk is some kind of coherent story that runs through it. So, a good talk should basically read like if you read a transcription of it, it should basically read like a good blog post, like a persuasive essay or a good story or something like that. And so it really helps a lot to write it out. Even if you're not writing out exactly every word you're going to say, just to at least write out like a general overview that is readable, so that you can then treat it a little bit like a blog post as you're writing it, and be able to edit things, move things around, reframe things in ways that make more sense as a coherent story. Because if you don't do that, and I've had talks where I've done that. I've had talks where I haven't done that. The ones where I just opened up Keynote and just started making slides have always been substantially worse. The ones that I start out like just as a presentation that way, it's just always worse. My best talks, and I haven't done that many, but ultimately like my good talks are the ones where I have written it out basically as a blog post style of speaking and structurally first, and then gone and made the slides from that point. And this is all to say also that that you should treat it not as this kind of full waterfall process of like you write it all out, then you make the slides, then you go give them. All of my talks I have edited up until like the night before I've given them. Sometimes the same day I've given them, I'm still editing them because what you realize during rehearsal, which you should always rehearse your talks, hopefully even more than once if you have the time. Before you give them, because rehearsing it like by yourself, running through it, like actually like standing up with a clicker and having your laptop in presentation mode, like actually like running through it as you would give it, giving it to a room of nobody is incredibly valuable to get a sense for kind of what works, what doesn't, how it flows, how it doesn't flow, like what parts you stumble over, what parts need to be rethought or don't belong or kind of break the rhythm or whatever else. The rehearsal part of it is invaluable, and I highly, highly recommend that you never give a talk that you have not rehearsed if it's this kind of format. And we'll get to whether I have some nitpicks about this format that I'll get to later, but in the kind of traditional format of you have a person standing in front of a crowd with a microphone and a presentation clicker going through a slide deck and talking, you need to have rehearsed that because otherwise basically it shows if you haven't rehearsed it, and it really helps to get out a lot of the problems that you kind of stand them away if you go through some rehearsals and realize what doesn't work and edit what needs to be edited.
Yeah, and I think too, it's what I find is most helpful when I'm preparing a talk, and I don't quite go the road that you do, where you kind of outline it. Like I tend to think it through in my head, and it's the kind of thing that once I sign up for a talk, I'll like in the back of my mind for like a month, I'm kind of running through this vague sense of what I want to accomplish. And I think one of the key things that I found is that if I can condense what I'm trying to say to, a few sentences or a 1 minute kind of overview, like I can kind of get this kernel of like, this is the thing that I want the audience to come away with. And I can be very concise and specific about that. I always find that's very helpful for me to prepare a compelling talk. And as I go through my rehearsals, I can kind of judge if I'm going down any dead ends or things that aren't connecting back to that main point. Because the reality, I think, too, is I used to be really scared of public speaking, and a lot of that was coming from overemphasizing, I think, the reaction that your audience is going to have to your talk, that you put all this time and effort into it. And the reality, and initially I used to think that everyone is going to be like hanging on every word and really thinking about it and like internalizing it. But then I started to go to conferences and I realized that what I leave with a talk is a general impression far more often than I do like a specific, like a detailed understanding or analysis of what someone just said. Like, you kind of get this high level, well, that's kind of what they were saying. And if what you want to do as you're preparing it, I feel like, is to make sure that that impression that you're going to be leaving someone with is the actual impression that you're trying to leave them with. And so as you do it, if you have this core thesis that you can kind of compare all of your slides with, compare all of the little like anecdotes or the lines of thinking you're doing towards, I feel like that makes it a much more compelling thing because everything is just pointing back to the same point over and over and over again.
When you're writing it or when you're thinking about what it will be like to give a conference talk and maybe you're stressing out about it, like one of the things that I read, I think it was like there's that one book like about that everybody reads about giving presentations. I've totally forgotten what it is. This is one, and I read like the intro basically, and that's it because I don't read very very well. But one of the things I learned from that, which is a very valuable lesson, is that if you think about what people stress out about. Most of the time, people are stressed out with the prospect of giving the talk about what if I say or too much, or I stumble over a sentence, or I fumble something, or I don't say something right. And the reality is that if you've been to conferences, if you actually think about it and actually pay attention to what people are saying word for word, take like a little transcription for a minute in your mind, and you'll see that people on stage are constantly fumbling over their words, or constantly saying or like, and you are actually auto-correcting that in your head as you're listening. So it doesn't really matter at all. That is not a kind of thing you need to worry about when you're doing that kind of public speaking. It basically, the room does not care if you say or they just don't care. So that isn't something you have to worry about. And you're right that you also have to worry less about like every single thing you're saying being great or accurate or tied together, because the room is going to have very different levels of people paying attention. Especially, look around a tech conference. Anybody you see with a laptop, they're not paying attention. Anyone with the phone in their hand, they're not paying attention. Anyone who's going to get a coffee or drink, they're not paying attention. So you're talking to maybe a third of the room who's actually listening. But where it can help to have a coherent story is to keep people's attention. Like if you're kind of all over the place, or there's some rough spots in the presentation where like you're throwing in stuff that didn't really need to be there, or you're not really or you're telling some kind of long convoluted story that doesn't really make sense, or whatever else, you're giving people opportunities to tune out. And so if you can keep them engaged with something that's a little bit better rehearsed and edited, more people will hear what you're trying to say. And people who want to pay attention will have an easier time paying attention.
Yeah, and I think it's also probably fair to say it's always better to run short than run long.
Yes.
Obviously conference organizers, if you're somebody, they give you a slot, you want to be respectful of, if they say it's a half-hour slot, don't show up and do a 10-minute talk. Like, that probably wouldn't go well. But on the flip side, if you have to go one way or the other, always run short. No one's ever going to be like, it's like if you leave the audience being like, I wish you would just had talked for hours and hours. It's like, you're doing great. Don't worry about it. But on the flip side, if someone's like, why won't he? He's like, is he ever going to finish? Is this like, where is this going? That is far more problematic than being too short.
Exactly. And then I guess the next thing to talk about is kind of like, if you're going to do one of these talks, kind of the mechanics of like what should your presentation include, what should it not include, how to do certain things. I mean, number one that these presentations almost always include is slides. You have some kind of slide deck, usually from Keynote, or if you are in the Microsoft world, from PowerPoint, and you go through this slide deck, and it can be like, meaningfully structured or whatever else. It could be heavily designed. It could be very bare bones. It could be all pictures or all text or whatever else. I would say, from my experience making slides, there's always going to be other people at the conference whose slides look way better than mine, and that will make me feel bad. But the reality is that spending a lot of time on your slides, especially the kind of conferences that listeners of the show would attend or be asked to speak at, a lot of like kind of nerdy ones, spending a ton of time on your slides is a massive time sink that will never end, and is probably not worth stressing too much out about. Like, I mean, one of my talks I gave at Singleton a few years back, I didn't even have slides, because I was like, I had a bad experience with slides at a previous conference, and I said, all right, next time I do one, no slides. It was totally fine. Like, if you have like a good enough story to speak, and you can keep people's attention well enough by just the words, and it's a little bit harder, but it's possible, then doing it without slides is actually kind of freeing and wonderful. But if you're going to have slides, I would say, again, for the people listening to this show, doing like geeky and programming types of conferences, I would say don't spend a whole lot of time trying to make them the most incredibly designed slides ever. Keep them very simple. Don't put a lot of text on them. Just keep it simple. Single sentences or words. Pictures if you have to show pictures. Definitely don't be reading off of them. Simple stuff you can get from pretty much any guide on how to do good presentations.
Yeah, and I think in many ways it reminds me of app design and the way that I have to approach it myself, where I always admire slide decks that are beautiful and really well put together and really clever. But the reality is, in the same way that I'm not really an app designer, and I can't make, like, there's a certain kind of design that I love to look at in an app, but I just can't do myself. I understand that in the same way, when I'm designing a Keynote deck, I can't make it look pretty in that way. And so all of the presentations I think I've ever given, I open up Keynote, I choose the first template, which is a black background with white text.
That's very important, by the way, because if you at any conference you see, like you see the problems when somebody has a white background, basically this is being projected by a dim, crappy projector onto a gray wall or screen. So like anything that has like a white edge, it's going to be all like, this blurry white edge, and it's just going to look like a big square in the middle of the wall. Like, whereas if you have a black background and white elements, then those elements seem like they're floating in the middle of the wall. You don't see the borders around it, basically, and that's why Apple's slide decks are always, like when they're presenting things, it's always black backgrounds with things just kind of floating in the middle. That's why it looks better and it's easier to see for the people in the room.
Yeah, and then beyond that, I think just like you said, it's being careful to. For me, my slides are usually like a short phrase, like 2 or 3 words on each slide. They're just there for emphasis. They're not there to convey any information typically. Like every now and then they'll have a slide that's, it's a graph or it's a picture or a diagram where it's supposed to convey information, but otherwise it's just, essentially whatever sentence I'm saying right now, if there's something I want to emphasize, it's on the slide behind me. And it's kind of like, not like a transcript in that way, but it's, if you just went through and listened and looked at the slides, they're just there to emphasize things. But the next thing also I wanted to mention too is it's the importance of, if you actually are doing this and you actually like the experience of doing it. So, you signed up, you've built this presentation, the actual experience of going and giving a talk, some things to keep in mind. One is you always want to, or ideally you'd always want to do it, not like a run through in the venue, but you ideally will have your slides on the machine that they're going to be run on. You're going to want to have the clicker. You want to stand on the stage and, just hit next slide a few times. Make sure everything looks good. Make sure you feel comfortable with where everything is. Like the worst thing is if you just, at the last minute, hand somebody a zip drive, which is kind of amusing, but in conferences are the only situation and I can encounter now where I ever have to use like a little USB thumb drive.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be the universal way of getting conference slides to the organizers. But you hand that to somebody, like you don't want to be handing that to them the moment before you step on stage, because who knows what's going to happen when they try and open that Keynote deck. And so you want to do a quick run through. You want to kind of make sure everything's together. And for me, at least I find too, that it makes me a little less nervous if all of the practical logistic parts are taken care of, that I know where I'm going to be. I know what I'm going to hold in my hand, what kind of microphone it's going to be, for example. Like it makes a big difference in terms of if you are going to have a handheld microphone, where you're going to have to be aware of keeping that in a constant place where your mouth is. If it's a lapel microphone, where you have to be careful of how you move your shoulders. Because if you have a lapel microphone, sometimes you need to be careful that you don't turn your head, the opposite direction of your shoulders, where suddenly your voice starts to fall off from the microphone. Or if it's the really cool ones, the ones that kind of like stick out of your ear and come down, where you can have a bit more flexibility. But it's a good thing to run through that. And in my experience, if you ask an organizer, hey, I'd love to do a quick run through of my slides, like I want to be more prepared, I very rarely will you encounter an organizer who's like, no, that we can't do that. Like their goal is for you to do well. And so it's always a good idea to try and do that. Do a quick run through, make sure you feel comfortable in the space and are confident that everything's going to work. And so you don't have those things weighing on you as you're getting ready to actually do it.
All right, so now we're going to talk about basically, things like, is it worth doing conference speaking and why you might want to in the format, etc. But first, our sponsor, which is always worth talking about. Our sponsor this week is Linode. Go to linode.com/radar to learn more. Sign up and take advantage of a $20 credit, or you can use the promo code radar20 at checkout. Linode is an amazing web host. They offer a combination of high-performance SSD Linux servers spread across 8 data centers around the world. They're a fantastic solution for your server infrastructure. David and I both use them. We've used them for a very long time, way longer than they've been sponsoring the show. With Linode, you can get a server up and running in just under a minute with plans starting at just $10 a month. That now gets you 2 gigs of RAM for $10 a month. That's incredible. You can also choose your resource level, your Linux distro, whichever distro you want. They have a ton they support, and your node's location and all their data centers right from the Manager tool. Linode servers are great for things like running private Git servers, hosting large databases, running web apps, running a mail server, operating back-end services for powerful applications like iOS apps, and so much more. Anything you can do with a Linux server, you can do at Linode. With industry-leading native SSD storage and access to a 40 gigabit network, you will have all the power you need to get your tasks done. As a listener of this show, if you sign up at linode.com/radar, you'll not only be supporting us, but you'll also get $20 towards any Linode plan. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, there's nothing to lose. So go to linode.com/radar to learn more, sign up, and take advantage of that $20 credit, or use promo code RADAR20 at checkout. Thank you so much to Linode for supporting the show. So we've basically talked so far about, like, if you want to do conference speaking, like how, some general tips and pointers as much as we can fit into like 18 minutes of how to do it, kind of, how to write and how to do some technical sides of it. I want to talk a little bit about, though, reasons why you might want to do this at all and reasons why you might not want to do this at all. If you get to any level of notability in a field, especially in the tech field, you are likely to be asked to speak at some kind of event or conference, and especially like in our little world of app and tech people, we have lots of conferences, big and small. Many of them are kind of more commercially run, and where the speakers are getting paid a substantial amount, and the tickets cost a lot of money, and they're usually larger, and they usually appeal to like wider markets, like a Java conference or whatever. And then you have a lot of these like smaller indie ones that I think the iOS world has more of those typically, where you have like smaller budgets. Oftentimes the speakers are not getting paid either at all, or like they might have their travel expenses and ticket covered, but no additional money after that, or some small amount, like under $2,000, say. Obviously, that it varies for you whether that's considered a small amount, but something in that range, And so you can look at like whether to do this as like, basically, if you're going to be a professional conference speaker, if you are going to, if you want to speak for money, if the money is what drives you here, you really need to be doing it a lot. And that's why like the people who speak on conference circuits, they tend to make a small number of talks and give each one a high number of times. Sometimes they'll give the same talk all around the country or all around the world at different events for like a whole year, because that's their business. They make one amazing talk that is applicable to a wide audience in a certain industry, and they go around the world and they get paid good money, because that is effectively that's their full-time job, or that is most of their job. Maybe they use that to build credibility to sell more books, or they write books to increase their speaking fees while speaking. So that is a whole career, and if you want to do that, that is a very different career than being a software developer. And that might be well suited to you, but you have to decide, whether that's the kind of career that you want and all the things that come along with it, like a lot of travel and things like that. If that's not your goal, if your goal is simply to speak at a conference because it might be fun, or you want to attend that conference, and that's an easy way to attend it, or you want to promote something that you're doing, like an app you're making, that's a very different job. And that in that kind of case, whether or how much you're being paid is way less important, because chances are whatever they're going to offer you is not going to be worth the week plus of work that you're going to lose by agreeing to do this. Not to mention the value of whatever stress it might put you through. So the money part of it, I think, is almost irrelevant for most people who are in our kind of business, because it's not going to be enough money where the money is going to matter to you in all likelihood. So I would say ignore the money part of it and really think about, like, do I want to do this to promote something, or to give back to a conference I've loved for years, or to just get better at public speaking or whatever else? And that's a very different question. And so, like, to me, I've actually decided over the last couple of years that it is almost never worth doing it for me, because I get so much stress about it, and I lose so much time to it. and that even when I go to a conference to speak at it, I end up not really able to enjoy that conference until my talk is over, which is often at least halfway through it. And so it is, and like all like the fun like socializing and things that happen before my talk, I basically don't enjoy or don't even get to attend. So I have recently found that I would rather just do like podcasts and occasional blog posts to get my message out and hardly ever speak at conferences, and then just attend conferences because I enjoy them, and that way I'm able to enjoy them, rather than really do a lot of talks. And that's why I do almost no talks anymore. What do you think?
So I think there's a tricky balance, and I think for sure, I think you're right in the sense that I don't do conferences for financial reasons. Like they're definitely a loss, part of my professional career at this point. Like and going down the route of trying to do it more professionally where you would actually get reasonable speaking fees and things, it's just a whole other world that I don't really have much interest in. And I think when I was starting out and I had the first time like a conference organizer reached out to me and said, "Hey, I think you'd be a good fit for this conference." I remember it's like I wanted to do it mostly just so that I would have done it. And not in like a oh, look at me, I've done it kind of thing, but to eliminate the fear of it. That I think public speaking is one of the things that it's so easy to get scared of, to really have genuine, honest fear about. But the only way you can really get over that is to sort of work on it and try it. And if you're well prepared, it's a little, it's less scary than you might expect. And largely, I do conference speaking now just for the purpose of practicing and developing that skill, to make it easier and better for myself down the road, to give myself opportunities that I may not otherwise have to speak at. There are some conferences that I, would have always wanted to go to, for example. And it's like you kind of have the goal of like, well, maybe one day I could get to speak at that. And the only way you're going to be sort of good enough to do that is if you have practiced. And one thing I will say is a nice way to start out, if you're kind of trying to feel this out for yourself, is it something that's worth it for you? Is it something that you'd like to do? Is to start small. And there's a lot of conferences that are small, like really, like I think of like CocoConf as an example of this, where it's a relatively small multi-track conference that is probably able, anyone who is able to put in some preparation could probably speak at. Or another example is a lot of user groups. Mm-hmm. While conference speaking is a bit more sophisticated, a lot of local, user groups will have monthly things where someone gets up and talks for 10 minutes, 20 minutes about something cool they're working on. And you can kind of get a feel for it. But it is a tricky question to say, like, is it worth it? Because I think it's something that you typically are doing for reasons other than strictly rational reasons. Like for me, it's a lot of it's about conquering a fear and being comfortable doing this so that I don't have this part of my professional skill set that I feel like isn't there. Because while the nature of being an independent developer and doing work, largely by myself, is not that I need to keep working, have tremendous communication skills, but I would feel bad about letting those skills just sort of fall waste. And so overall, I think it is a tricky thing to find that balance. And I think it is very important to understand that it is a huge cost and sink in terms of time that, it all said and done, like I'm speaking at UL this year. And that is a conference that's in Ireland. So in addition to like roughly maybe a week's worth of prep, I'm also going to be flying somewhere and dealing with jet lag and then dealing with jet lag on the way back. In many ways, we had these similar conversations when we were talking about going to WWDC. Like, is it worth it to go to that? Where, you can kind of get a lot of the feeling of it without actually going. You can get a lot of the information, but there's something different about actually going. And for me, conference speaking is a great way to kind of get myself to go to more conferences, because I feel it's a hard thing to sometimes decide, do I want to pay to travel? Do I want to pay to buy a ticket and be away from my family to attend? It makes it a little bit easier where I feel like I'm accomplishing something by doing that I'm getting better at speaking as a result. And typically it's helpful that they pay for the accommodation, the travel, and the ticket. But there's definitely a balance to be struck there between am I getting enough out of it? And the nice thing about conference speaking is, if you really want to do it and pursue it a lot, you can probably find opportunities to do that. If you only want to do it 1 or 2 times, you can probably find a way to do that too. Like it's easily scalable up and down between the two extremes.
Yeah, and I mean, to close this out, because we're out of time now, I think I would say if you're on the fence about whether to speak at a conference, reasons that you don't need to worry about are things like, what if I'm terrible at it? What if people laugh at me? It's like that doesn't really happen in this community. Like that literally never happens. So you don't have to worry about that. I think what you mainly have to worry about is it worth it to me? And if you've never done it before, it's a good reason. Just do it, as you said. Just try it, just to find out if it's worth it for you. You might find that you love it. You might find that you hate it. But you should, if you have the opportunity to try it, and then decide from there.
Exactly, and I think that's the right way to think about it. Just keep an open mind to it, and it's an important thing to just try. And if it doesn't work, that's no problem. But if you've learned something about yourself in the process.
All right, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.